Good morning and welcome to our next lecture in Ethical Issues in the Professions in Business. As you probably recall, my name is T.J. Riley and I'll be presenting your lesson today. Today we'll be discussing Topic 8 on the outline, Moral Perspectives, which also leads us to Chapter 3 in our textbook, Living and Leading with Integrity. And we're going to start today by just a quick review on your outline of some of the characteristics of a person with integrity. Today we're going to start with number 3. We're going to talk about how a person with integrity has the ability to evaluate short and long-term consequences and thereby render good, successful ethical decisions. So that will be our focus today on Chapter 3 in your book and Topic 8. So let's get started, get your outlines out and follow along. Here we go with consequences. We're going to focus at first on the utilitarian view, which basically is focused on consequences, trying to determine the consequences of an ethical decision when perhaps you have a number of options, any number of options actually. And all utilitarian viewpoints, perspectives, have a particular argument form. And that argument form is on your outline and also here on the board today. I have a microphone on, so I kind of have to watch it. It's like having a tail. And that's always fun when, of course, you're a human being and you don't normally have a tail. So here we have the argument form for utilitarian arguments. We'll talk about two forms of utilitarianism today: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. It's really hard to say utilitarianism over and over, I'll tell you. But here's the argument form, and it's on your outline. Basically, you're going to recognize that there is an ethical problem. Usually that's not too difficult. Then you're going to say, okay, what sort of options do I have to choose from to address this particular problem? So you're going to look at your options, and you may have only a few and you may have many, depending upon, of course, the problem at hand. So the next step then is, here's where the utilitarians, hold on, I'm going to step in front of this so I can write like a real person, although that's pretty much questionable when it's my writing on the whiteboard, as you'll remember. And that's a long word, consequences. I think that turned out well, don't you? Yes. Utilitarians are focused on the consequences, so that's a key step, of course, in their argument form. And last and certainly not least is going to be what we might call an outcome. We're going to pick one of the options, right? And after we've considered the consequences, we're going to render an outcome. We should do X, or whatever option. Should do option, just for fun, let's say we have 3 options, option C. And that's after we've calculated everything in the consequences realm. So there we have the basic argument form for utilitarianism, and we'll call it POCO. Since I'm rather short and my name is short, I also like to shorten up things like that. And so POCO is the basic argument form that utilitarians use. So now let's focus on our first form of utilitarianism called act utilitarianism. And we'll start with the very formal definition from our textbook on page 41, I believe. And it goes like this, on your outlines too. One ought to do the action that will create more social utility than any of the other alternatives or options from POCO that you have under consideration. Okay? So that definition, though, is got some terms in it that we want to focus on, and we're going to kind of unpack that definition so that we can actually use utilitarianism to assist us when we're faced with particular ethical dilemmas and issues. Pardon me a minute. It's allergy season, as I've already mentioned. So we're going to start talking about, well, what's this social utility part? I mean, we don't use those terms very often in everyday life, So we're going to unpack that so that we can understand that formal definition of utilitarianism a little bit better. So as utilitarians, there's three parts to figuring out what social utility is. The first one's going to be that overall balance of negative and positive, utility or consequences. Another one will be, we're going to look over the long term, and we're going to look then at the third part, which is for all involved, for all affected by the particular option or consequences. So first of all, let's talk quickly about how are we going to figure out what the overall social utility is. Basically, it's sort of like making a pro-con list. You're going to take all the good consequences you can foresee about each of the options you might have. Let's say you just have three options, option A, option B, option C to consider. So for option A, you're going to say, okay, here are all the good consequences if I choose to do this. And same for B, and same for C. Then you're going to go back and say, now here are all the bad consequences, all the cons to that option A, B, and C. Then you're going to take the good consequences, subtract the bad consequences, and see what number you end up with. And of your three options, A, B, C, you're going to want to choose the one, of course, that has the most social utility or has the highest positive number. So if option A ends up with some negative number, their bad consequences outweigh the good consequences, well, of course, utilitarians would not choose that particular options. So when you've done that with all your options, you have the social utility of each one and can choose based on that. But that's not the only thing you can consider. The next thing you'll consider is long and short-term consequences. Often short-term consequences are much easier to see, and they're immediate. People say, oh, well, look, we need to do this right now. And one thing we can think about is an example. Let's say that you're in charge of figuring out where the next local landfill is going to be. And you know that you have this really good option on some land. It's cheap, it's available, and you think that's the best choice. I'm going to buy that land and put the landfill in there. But that's just on the short term. On the long term, we have other considerations, which might be if there are communities of people and houses right near that area. In the long term, you'd say, well, gee, if this area continues to grow and something happens that the landfill leaches into the water table and spoils the water in that area, that would affect quite a few people and really make their drinking water what they call, I think, unpotable, undrinkable. And so that's how you can see in an ethical decision that you're making that you have to consider those long-term consequences. The short-term might be it's efficient, it's monetarily cheap, and it's ready to go, but in the long term you may affect a lot of people, which brings us to the third consideration when we're looking at consequences for all concerned. Now sometimes, in that case, in the landfill case, for all concerned may be a whole city full of people, maybe just a community. Maybe it wouldn't happen at all, but you would want to consider that when you're deciding which option you should choose. And sometimes the people affected by an ethical decision are as small as our family, or maybe even just yourself. Although that seldom happens, it's possible. So those are kind of the three parts when we talk about, of all your options in the POCO, when you're looking at the consequences, as a utilitarian is focused on the consequences, here's a way to do it. And it's involved in the decision procedure of measuring the good and bad consequences to figure out the overall social utility, also looking at long-term and short-term benefits, consequences of the choices, of the options, and also consider who will be affected. I think we'll stop the tape here. If you're at home viewing, take a moment and think about that, how utilitarians make those decisions. Because the point of studying this, of course, is so that when we're faced with ethical decisions and issues, we can have some procedures, have some theory, have some guidelines to help us make those decisions. Also, if you're in the classroom, please stop the tape and discuss what you think of utilitarianism and maybe some possible difficulties in actually using this approach. So let's stop here and take a moment, and then I'll come back and we'll finish up our discussion of utilitarianism. Okay, I hope you've had a good think or a good discussion about maybe how you could use utilitarianism, act utilitarianism in particular, which is what we've talked about so far, in making ethical decisions. I think it's worthy to talk about some of the problems that you might have run into, rather applying the utilitarian approach. The first one basically is it's very difficult in some ways to measure that utility. It's very hard to know all the consequences, good or bad, and it kind of involves this kind of predictiveness that we don't always have in every situation. Even in the landfill, we can't predict what will happen in the future when we take an area and turn it into a garbage landfill. We don't know if it'll seep into the water table or if it'll be perfectly contained. So those things are very difficult sometimes to predict all the negative and positive consequences of maybe you've got 5 options. Whew, I'm tired just thinking about it. So that's just a problem with utilitarianism in some cases. Another one is when we start talking about, we have to consider what will happen for all concerned. It's difficult because it's hard to consider, who are we going to consider in all concerned. The Native American clan, the Iroquois, who were quite a group in the, I think, 1600s to about the middle 1700s. Here they had what they called the Great Law of the Iroquois. And I'll read it to you because these folks really did think about who we should consider in all concerned, and they also had a real consideration for long-term consequences. So here's the Great Law of the Iroquois. In our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So for the Iroquois, they are going to think not just about now, not even about my children or my grandchildren, but we're talking great, 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 7 forward people on the earth. So for utilitarians, the Iroquois would say, well, I mean, you have to count 7 generations, and you have to consider all of those people. So even if it's just your family, that exponentially grows very quickly when you start thinking about 7 generations. So that's a problem utilitarians have too. It's like, what counts and who counts when you're trying to figure out the consequences of your decisions. And another one that I think is particularly difficult is what if you just don't have a lot of time to do these complex calculations on maybe 5 options. In the landfill example, if I've gotten options from 5 different departments, I have to sit down and do that. Well, I might have the time to do that with the landfill, but there are often decisions that we make in business and as a professional that we don't have that kind of time, that we don't know the exact outcomes, we don't know the consequences ahead of time, and we just don't have the time to calculate. So in that case, if you need to make a decision quickly, utilitarianism is maybe not the approach you'll want to pick. It's okay for some decisions when you know the consequences, maybe when you don't have too many options in front of you, it might be just the approach to pick, but it may not be the one that will cover for everything. So let's move on now to the cousin of act utilitarianism, which is rule utilitarianism. And we'll just go over this briefly. I mean, it's covered quite well in your book. And we'll just basically talk about the difference between the two. Both are going to use that POCO form. Know the problem, look at your options, think about the consequences, and also then consider the outcome that you should do. Now, ACT utilitarians look at it on a case-by-case basis, but rule utilitarians are going to try to develop rules that will apply to any and every case that comes up for them. So that's their focus, which is why they're called rule utilitarians, pardon me. And so their formal definition basically is do the action that is in accord with the rule that would, if generally followed by everyone, would bring about more social utility than any of the other options. So you see that it sounds like its cousin, ACT utilitarianism, but its focus is on, you know, if everybody followed these particular rules, these outcomes would be very good. A little difficulty rule utilitarians have is that, you know, getting an effective rule is not so easy. Easier said than done. There's a good saying, right? Because in your rule, you don't want it to be too broad. You don't want it to be a rule like, be nice, or something that's just too broad, because sometimes there are many more things to consider in making a decision than be nice, especially if you're a businessman and let's say you have, or a businesswoman, and you have an employee who is under par on their performance and evaluation, and you really do need to fire them. You can't just, I mean, you can be nice, but you're still going to have to fire them. So be nice can't be your guiding rule for that kind of a situation, probably, or it won't serve you well anyway. And you don't want your rule to be too narrow or too specific. You don't want your rule to be, well, I'll just consider my needs, and that'll be the rule, and that's how I'll make all my decisions. As you can imagine, that won't be very effective in the short term, and certainly won't in the long term for you. So the decision procedure there for rule utilitarianism is similar to ACT utilitarianism, but it's going to focus on rules. So list all your rules. What are the consequences of using each rule? Choose the rule with the most utility. Go back to those three things we talked about, measuring the good and bad consequences for all concerned over the short and long term. So they're similar in that way. And then apply the rule and say, okay, now what actions are going to fit with that rule? So that's the decision procedure, and it runs into some of the same difficulties of predicting and calculating that ACT utilitarianism has. And as we finish up this part on utilitarianism, part of Chapter 3, we need to think about, utilitarians have a certain focus, and so we need to ask ourselves, are consequences and rules the only elements involved in making a good ethical decision? Of course, the rest of Chapter 3 will be our focus for answering this question. We'll move on to Kant's idea of respect for others, and we'll finish up Chapter 3 with another option, what we'll call living virtuously, and we'll talk about our personal virtues and how those would translate into our actions and behaviors and hence our ethical decisions. So this wraps up our talk on utilitarianism, and I'll see you again soon. Bye. Good afternoon.